Today, Miko Peled joins the Palestine Pod. Miko is an Israeli-American author and activist for Palestinian rights. Your father was, of course, a key figure in the events of 1948 and 1967, which resulted in the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population from Palestine. And yet you go on this journey that rattles all of your deeply held beliefs about Zionism and Israel.
My family was like, Zionism was the bread and butter. You know, it's kind of semi-fascist, really, because Zionism and the state are the most important things in everybody's life. Really, all I did was I just went literally almost across the street, because that's all you have to do. To walk from the, as Fanon describes it, the sphere of the privileged and the oppressor, to the sphere of the other. In Palestine, it's really across the street, and there is a good version of Zionism. Well, that's part of the myth. There never was, there never is, and there never can be a good version of a racist ideology.
It's the Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Sit back and relax. Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Expand your mind.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where a Palestinian-American lawyer and a Jewish-American comedian break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of spreading awareness about the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's going on, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and Mikey Intifada if you report to a cubicle and sell your soul every day.
Good one. So we're joined by a very special guest today, but before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you're here on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, please leave us a review. It takes 2 minutes, but it has such a huge impact and allows our podcast to reach more people. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources at palestinepod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at palestinepod@gmail.com, or you can engage with us on Instagram at the Palestine Pod. We would love to hear from you all. Today, Miko Peled joins the Palestine Pod. Miko is an Israeli-American author, speaker, host, and activist for Palestinian rights. He's the author of Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. This book describes the persecution and the closure of what was America's largest Muslim charity organization, the Holy Land Foundation, and the subsequent trials and convictions of 5 Palestinian Muslim Americans in what was called by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges the most egregious cases of injustice committed to date against Muslim leaders in the United States. Miko also authored The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. This book is an autobiographical work that takes the reader through the life of the Peled family since Miko's grandparents settled in Palestine in the early 20th century. Miko is also host of his own podcast, where he amplifies the voices of human rights defenders on the ground in Palestine and in exile. Today, he's a fierce supporter of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights for all in historic Palestine. Miko, welcome to the Palestine Pod.
Thank you. It's great to be with you guys.
Thank you so much for being here.
We so appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
So, Miko, your story is an incredible one, to say the least. To get started, let's talk about The General Son, which both Michael and I read. So in The General Son, you share your life story from growing up the son of an Israeli war general in Jerusalem and the grandson of one of the signers of the Israeli Declaration of Independence to how you got where you are today. Your father was, of course, a key figure in the events of 1948 and 1967, which resulted in the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinian population from Palestine. And today, those individuals and their descendants remain overwhelmingly refugees all over the world. You have described your family as, quote, as strong of a Zionist family as you could possibly have. And yet you go on this journey that rattles all of your deeply held beliefs about Zionism and Israel. And this book is a recollection of that journey. By the end of the book, we get a clear vision, though, of your stance on Palestinian rights, anti-Zionism, support for BDS, and the belief in one democratic secular state in Palestine, a state where Palestinians have equal rights on their land, and where Palestinian refugees will be allowed to even return to Palestine. I almost wish that we got another chapter elaborating on those ideas because they came so late in the book, and I was really cherishing those words and reflections towards the end. But perhaps as a first question, can you describe what it was like to go through such a radical change? And looking back on the book with hindsight, would you have written it any differently today?
Well, thanks again for having me on your podcast. It's great to chat with you. The interesting thing about the book is that it required a lot of patience to write, because I personally was at the end of the book, but I had to write the whole thing and go through the whole process, and it required a lot of patience. And I have quite a few Palestinian friends, one of whom is the author Susan Abul Hawa, who wrote a review, which I really liked. That reading the book made them crazy. I mean, Susan Abul Hawa wanted to send the book back and say, "Well, why am I reading this nonsense?" Until she got to the end. But that was the process. In other words, it's an honest illustration of the journey, and it's very difficult for me to read it today, because I don't have that kind of patience. I'm at the end of the book, and I'm beyond the end of the book, and it's time to act. But it's excruciating. It's a very painful process. I mean, I can't imagine how painful it would be for a Palestinian to read this, and where I describe the glories of the Israeli army and the Zionists and all this. But that's where I was, and that's where most Israelis are. And when I say I come from as Zionist a family as there is, it's true. My family was like, Zionism was the bread and butter. Zionism, it's kind of semi-fascist, really, because the Zionism and the state, and that's how it's said, the state, are the most important things in everybody's life. How you contribute to the state, what your family did for the state, who did, you know what I mean? And that was the family, and these were the close friends, and these were the people my parents associated with, and so on. So it couldn't get any more Zionist and patriotic than that. And really all I did was I just went literally almost across the street, because that's all you have to do to walk from the, as Fanon describes it, the sphere of the privileged and the oppressor, to the sphere of the other. In Palestine, it's really across the street in many places, or a short drive. And that's really all I had to do. And it's incredible how short it is geographically, but how difficult it is in every other way, and how many obstacles you have to go through in order to take that journey as an Israeli. Getting over the fear, getting over the stigma, getting over the racism, getting over the characteristics of the Arabs as just basically wanting to kill us. And your whole life, the image of young Palestinians is the image of death, is the image of terrorism. So you have to start to humanize people. And you don't know that you have to do that until you're actually there and you go through the process of having to do it. So it's an excruciating process, and it only shows just how effective the Zionist education system and the racism, the indoctrination to racism is in Israel. But yeah, that was you described the book very, very well, actually.
Yeah.
She has a way of doing that.
Yeah.
Being a lawyer helps, I think. I want to go back to what you just said, which is that definitely as a Palestinian, the book was very difficult to read. Yeah. And obviously knowing your work and following it for several years now, I kind of had the spoiler alert. So I knew the book would have a good ending, but it was just the process of getting through it to finally see that good ending. One of the main things that I think made it so difficult for me was that throughout the book, we see so many of the figures that we as Palestinians know as colonizers, as responsible for the killing of our loved ones and our uprooting from our land. They appear as casual characters in the book. They're friends of the family. They, went to school with your sister. People like Ben Gurion, Rabin, Ehud Barak, and Netanyahu. And then at the same time, there's also these moments where you are witness to the cruelty of the Israeli army. So like when you are arrested for protesting alongside Palestinians in the West Bank and you're taken to the police station and there's that exchange with the officer who says he can't hold you because it would violate procedure since you are, quote, an Israeli and you have rights, you're not a Palestinian. And then also the part that just tore me up inside was when you recall hearing about how the Israeli army orders Palestinian fishermen off the boat of Gaza to jump in the water from their boats. They then shoot their boats and they yell at the fishermen to count to 100 until they drown. And as the book unfolds, you recall these incidents, and the more that you sort of go through this process, you're actually discovering the cruelty of the Israeli army, the cruelty of this institution. And it seems to you like it's almost a surprise, at least, as I'm reading it, it seems like there's this awakening to, wow, this is actually what you guys are doing. But as a Palestinian, I'm reading this and I'm like, well, of course that's what the Israeli army does. That's the only thing they've ever done, is to dispossess and oppress Palestinians. That's the raison d'etre of the Israeli army. So I guess my question on this point is ignorance really a problem amongst Jewish Israelis? Do you think a lot of them are in the dark? Or is there something else happening?
Well, today, nobody's in the dark because the discourse changed. What happened after 2000, after the failed Camp David, accord, after the Second Intifada, is that the mask fell off the Zionists, and Israeli discourse changed entirely. And it's almost like they realized, why are we bothering to pretend that we're something that we're not? We can get away with saying what we think and doing what we want. And that, as far as at least it was my experience, as far as my experience went, that was not the case. There was a lid on stuff like that. I certainly never saw it. I never heard anybody talk about it. We knew there were incidents, like in every army, like in every country, there are bad apples, so to speak. Bad things happen, but, we take care of that and we make sure it doesn't happen again. But we're basically the good guys here. And then as I embarked on this journey, I realized that this was a completely different story. But what changed in Israeli society is the discourse. Now, the other thing is, today, Israeli society, almost everybody has either themselves or a brother, a father, a cousin, a friend, a next door neighbor who is either in the military, in the secret police, in the Shabak, in the Mossad, in one of those gazillions of different branches of the Israeli defense that are engaged every day, every single day on a regular basis in that kind of activity. And people talk about it. I mean, nobody's ashamed of it. Nobody thinks there's a problem. I grew up in an environment where it was not talked about. And if it was brought up, it was, oh my goodness, no, this is so shameful. No, we don't do these sorts of things. We're not like that. That was the atmosphere. And to discover that I was, it sounds silly right now, but I mean, that was the environment. But today people talk about these things and nobody thinks there's a problem. So that facade was dropped, I think, mostly after 2000.
It's like that sketch where the actors are like, are we the bad guys? Really quickly, you spoke about in your book how you had reservations joining the army because you knew some of the brutality. How much did you know before you actually went into the army?
I just knew that the occupation was bad because, I heard it at home. My family, even though it was very Zionist, it was kind of a left-leaning, progressive Zionist, if you will. And so we knew the occupation was wrong. My father, after he retired from the military, promoted the idea of a two-state solution. He was one of those, the original Zionists who talked about the two-state solution as being the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And so that's what we heard at home. That's what everybody talked about. The circle of friends also changed a lot during those years. And so I knew that the occupation was bad. And I knew that, serving in the army and hitting protesters and bombing refugee camps was taking place and was wrong. And so I had reservations. But I mentioned that in the book, too. There's a sense of vanity that drives young Israeli guys into the military. A sense of power, a sense of vanity, and that, although it's masked as patriotism, but it's not. And plus, I really had nobody to talk to about this. There was nobody saying, hey, you know what, here's what's really going on. I just kind of picked up from whatever was, I could pick up. So and to this day, I mean, I regret that decision not to refuse. There were people, very few, but there were a few people of my, my age group that did refuse.
Yeah.
But and I wish I had, but no, I didn't. I went in willingly and happily.
Can I just ask you about this sort of line in the sand that we often hear about from liberal Zionists, and that is the idea of the occupation is wrong, the occupation of the territories which were occupied in 1967, is wrong, but the creation of the State of Israel itself, which resulted in an even greater expulsion and dispossession of Palestinians from their land, that somehow is not to be questioned, when in reality the same thing is happening. Land theft through conquest and dispossession. But for some reason, the creation of the state is not questioned by liberal Zionists, whereas 1967 might be, and we can sort of put into a box the moral issues that we're willing to grapple with and then completely ignore everything else.
Well, that early group of Zionists that included my father after 1967, they set certain parameters, and one of the parameters was that we don't talk about the past. We don't talk about 1948. We talk about the future. We talk about the West Bank and Gaza. We talk about a Palestinian state. We don't talk about the past. And that continues today. And so the liberal Zionists latch onto that. They go, no, we're not going to talk about the past. We're only going to talk about the future. But what has become completely clear over the years is there is no past and future. It's all the same process. In other words, 1967 was an extension of 1948.
Exactly.
It was not a separate thing. But in order to do that, you have to completely dismantle the myth. You have to dismantle the myth. Well, if you start dismantling the myth, then you can't be a liberal Zionist anymore. You have to be progressive, or you have to admit that you're a racist and you support violence and ethnic cleansing and all these terrible things. So they latch on to this sense of, we leave the past behind. We don't talk about 1948, but yes, the occupation is wrong. We don't question the legitimacy of the state of Israel. We don't question the legitimacy of Zionism. And that's what allows them to continue. That's why you can have J Street. That's exactly why you can have J Street, and you can have all these people go and speak at J Street, even Palestinians. Because, there's a sense of, there are good Zionists. There is a good version of Zionism. There's a good version of Israel that's possible. Well, that's part of the myth. There never was, there never is, and there never can be a good version of a racist ideology. There never can be a good version of an apartheid regime that is engaged in brutality and so on, and such terrible violence. So, but you have to dismantle the myth,
right,
in order to get to that point. Well, liberal Zionists don't want to do that. They want to maintain their happy identity as liberals, but also as Zionists.
So then you've actually answered one of my other questions, which is there a version of Zionism, a progressive form of Zionism that can coexist with care for Palestinian human rights and Palestinian self-determination? And I would, of course, argue that there is not, because the entire premise of Zionism is that Jews should live in Palestine and come from all over the world to settle the land of Palestine at the expense of those who are already in Palestine. So for me, these two concepts do not go together, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
It's more than that, actually. It's even worse than what you just said, because the basic concept of Zionism is that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. The Jewish people. So the Arabs are just invaders. There's no room for Arabs there, and also there nothing significant happened in the land of Israel since the Romans, expelled the Jews, which historically turns out perhaps never happened. But that's the theme, right?
Right.
So from that point on until Zionism, till the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, there's really nothing significant happened in the land of Israel. And there was a constant presence of Jewish people there. That's all that matters. 2,000 years of everything else that happened in Palestine and actually built Palestine is of no relevance. It only belongs to the Jews. There's only the Zionist narrative, and that's that. And well, it's a racist ideology that is built on a false premise. I mean, it can go even further back, because the premise that somehow Jews are a people with a land and a language and a history, a common land, language, and history, is also false. It's not true. That's why Orthodox Jews oppose Zionism.
Right.
Because they say Jews are a nation united by their religious laws, not by a land and language. That's why you could be a Yemenite Jew, an Iraqi Jew, and a Polish Jew, and you're all Jews, because it's about the faith. But Zionism threw all that away. They said, oh, that's all nonsense. The Bible is our history book. Palestine is our land, and Hebrew is our language, which, of course, none of that is really true. So there's no good version of that. There cannot be a good version of that. It's racism, and besides, again, we don't need to analyze what they say or what they think, because we can see what happened.
They're doing
77 days, over almost 100 years actually, of history in Palestine demonstrates very clearly what Zionism is about, what the objectives of Zionism are, and where this is leading. It leaves absolutely no room for doubt. James Baldwin says, I don't necessarily know what white people think of me or feel about me, but I can see what they do, and that's enough. And that's how I judge. It's the same thing. We can see what Zionists have done and what they continue to do.
Right. There's a part in The General Sun where you describe how during the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948, the coffee was still hot on the table in their homes. And that's actually a story that I grew up hearing, by the way, from my own grandparents and from other Palestinians in their generation. You also describe how your mother was offered a Palestinian home and she refused out of principle. So would you say that your family's relationship with Israel and Zionism was always at least a little bit complicated from its inception? Because the reality is that many Zionists did move into Palestinian homes. They didn't think twice about it. So is there something there that is kind of uncomfortable from the very beginning, or am I reading too much into it?
Well, the fact that my mother told me this story over and over and over and over again as I was growing up, about how she was offered this home. And, she was 22. She was already a mother. She was living, in a tiny apartment with her parents. I mean, couldn't have been fun. And suddenly she's offered, and I don't know if you've been to Palestine, but these homes in West Jerusalem, what they call them the Arab homes.
Yeah.
These are magnificent homes.
Yes.
This was a wealthy community. They built beautiful homes. It was a rich in every way, not just financially rich, but it was a rich community. In fact, I just did an interview on my Patreon podcast with Ghada Karmi, who was expelled in 1948. She's from, she lived exactly in that period. And we discussed exactly the same story. And Palestinians always appreciate when I talk about this story. But, she was offered these beautiful homes, spacious and so on. And she said, how can I move into the home of another family? How can I move into the home of another mother who now has to raise her family in exile as refugees? And so, but that did not ever translate to anything else, to any kind of action. I mean, she personally did not take the home. And, many years later, as we all came of age, we realized, wow, thank God, living with that guilt would have been even worse. But, she supported her husband 110%. And he was part of the Zionist militia. He was part of the Israeli army. I mean, the whole thing is her father, her entire being, her entire being was Zionism and the state of Israel. But she had this,
cognitive dissonance,
that was
maybe.
kind of, at least had the honesty to see that there were some really terrible things that took place. I think it's in the General Sun towards the end, where I'm sitting with her, and there's a signed photograph of David Ben Gurion that my father received. He used to give an autograph to all the generals. And I said, why is it still hanging here? I mean, the guy was a war criminal. She, oh, no, Ben Gurion, oh my goodness, no, Ben Gurion, without him, we would never have had a state. And so she lives in these two separate realities.
Yeah.
Couldn't get her to take that picture off.
So you described your grandfather's disdain for David Ben Gurion and how that impacted his future despite his accomplishments. Can you talk about how so-called moderate Zionists have always been pushed aside by the more militant right factions, and how that happens in a broader scheme in Israel's politics?
Well, yes. I mean, it started with this iron fist policy and iron fist mentality of Ben Gurion and the military, who wanted nothing more than just to maintain Israel as the toughest, meanest, craziest bully in the neighborhood, and that's it. Don't mess with us. We don't want peace. We don't want agreements. We're going to attack and attack and attack and make sure that that's it. So every time there was somewhat of an argument whether or not that is the best way for Israel to go forward, that argument was shut down by a war, by an operation, whatever the case may be, to say, see, these people are weak and they want us to be weak and they want us to make peace. But how can you make peace when you live in this neighborhood? And yeah, of course, if we were in Scandinavia, then maybe we can make peace with our neighbors. But look at who our neighbors are. And so how could we possibly make peace with them? And today, if you want to discredit someone, you say that they are left. You use the word left, the capital L. And it's ridiculous because you look at Israeli politics today, and when somebody wants to discredit Netanyahu, the people that are, the more extreme settlers, for example, they say that he is a lefty.
Which could not be further from the truth.
It's came to a point where the rush to the right is how you win the election, is how you gain votes, is how you gain popularity in Israeli politics today. And really, there used to be this glorious Zionist left, which of course was a myth, because you can't be, Zionist left is a myth. But today, even the Zionist left is ridiculed. There's not much left of it, a few small parties, but they're ridiculed. People look at them like they're idiots, like they're fools, and actually they are. And it continues. The neo-fascism is what Zionism. Zionism is a form of neo-fascism. There's no way around it, and Israel is the expression of that. There's no way around that.
Yeah, the absolute love for the military, the exalting of a strong figurehead, the glorification of war while otherizing people, and conscription, all of that are classic signs of fascism.
So Israelis are, offended if you say occupation, if you call Israel settler colonial.
Yep.
But only in English. In Hebrew, the words that are most commonly used in order to glorify Israel are occupation, settlements, and settlers and colonizers. I was meeting somebody, a friend in near Jaffa, and we met, and he said, well, let's meet near this big parking lot in Jaffa, which is called the colonizers parking lot. It's near the Conqueror's Street and across the road from the occupiers' park. These words are used all the time. Every street, every city, every town has a colonizer's plaza, for example, because they view these things as glorious. That is what glorifies Israel. That's how Israel was established. But don't you dare say it in English, because in English it doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
What is the disconnect between saying the same thing in Hebrew and the same thing in English?
Well, I think that in English it seems to them that it's hard to explain. It's a disconnect that I don't even know if that I can explain. But I think they understand that if you say settler colonialism today, it sounds bad. It's a bad thing. But when you're inside the Zionist mind, then it's glory, because these are the people that allowed Israel to become, a state, and the entire mythology is built on settlers, on colonizers, and on occupiers, and on conquerors. And, in Jerusalem, half the streets are named after either generals. Actually, not only Jerusalem, many of the cities, half the streets are named after either generals or military units, or, the tank brigade road. That's how everything is. That's how everything is. That's the reality there in Israel.
And those are, of course, names which were changed, right? These all used to have Palestinian names. And all of these, references to Occupiers Park and all of this General Street and whatever other examples you gave are part of the de-Arabization of Palestine.
Yes, of course. I don't know if you read The Return to Haifa by Ghassan Kanafani, but as they drive back into Haifa, after 1967, he talks about how he remembers the old street names. And of course, they're all gone, although the old street names have been changed. Of course, yeah.
When you were growing up, did you have a sense that this had happened or was happening in the culture that you were growing up as a part of? Or was this something that you really became aware of as an adult?
No, I grew up admiring all of this and adoring all of this completely. I only became aware of what this really is. And I talk about it in the book. That's part of the journey. When the journey began into Palestine, and things fell into place, and I realized that there are two narratives here, and they can't coexist.
Mm.
That also goes back to your question about can there be a good Zionism? These are
Yeah.
two narratives that cannot coexist. One negates the other, and so I had to choose, and everything I saw pointed in one direction. There's no option here. And you notice all these different things. You notice that the King David Street used to be called Salahuddin Street, and
Yeah.
all these different things, and Herzl Street used to be King Faisal Street, and all these kinds of things all around you. And then you can't, it's really difficult. For example, people like to go to the beach in Tel Aviv. That's like the if you know what happened in Jaffa, the destruction. If you know that that promenade, that beautiful grassy area, the beach is built on what used to be a thriving community, a thriving city with thousands upon thousands of people, you can't go to that beach. You just can't enjoy it. It's impossible to go.
You can't just sip martinis. You can't just enjoy the girls in bikinis with automatic rifles.
No, it takes away all of that. And knowledge can be a very dangerous thing. It's a little bit like walking around in some of the cities in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where that these new cities were built on the ashes of Jewish communities that were wiped out. You're literally walking on graves. I think that's part of the reasons why Israelis are so defensive about their past, about 1948, because if they start accepting that, then it not only destroys the legitimacy or any argument for the legitimacy of Israel, but it's more than that. I mean, you can't exist with yourself. You can't exist. You can't enjoy these things anymore. You can't be who you are anymore.
Threatens their very identity.
Yeah.
One of the major Zionist myths that you rebut in The General Sun is the notion that Israelis were attacked by the Arabs in 1967, and that military occupation of the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza that ensued was necessary as a result of this attack. Can you clarify this for us, set the record straight once and for all?
Sure. I do this all the time.
Yeah.
One of the things I did as I was working on the book was go into the Israeli army archives to learn about my father, basically, And one of the more interesting things was available were the minutes of the meetings of the Israeli High Command leading up to the 1967 war. Actual minutes of these meetings of the people who not only pushed for the war but prepared for it and executed it. The word threat doesn't even come up once. They talk about an opportunity. They talk about an opportunity to destroy they talk mainly about the Egyptian army, because the other armies were really not even, nobody discussed the other countries at that point. That it's an opportunity to once again destroy it because it's ill prepared. It's not going to be prepared for an attack, for a real war, for at least another 2 years. And they say it again, and they say it again, and they say it again. And every time they try to push the government to declare war or to approve a preemptive attack, and the government resists. And I talk about these two groups as well, the cabinet and the generals, and the differences between them. Every time that comes up, especially my dad would stand up and say, "What are you talking about? I mean, we're wasting an opportunity here. There's no threat." But then what they needed to do is they need to somehow apply pressure on the government. And the way they did that is by putting out this the story that there's an existential threat. Mm-hmm. That the Arabs are going to come and they're going to slaughter us and they're going to rape every woman and slaughter all of us. And I remember as a child hearing that the Arabs are going to come and slaughter us, and this is terrifying. But then as you read and then of course, the whole thing was over in 6 days. Once you start, connecting the dots and seeing what actually transpired during the war, then it's obvious that the whole thing was a lie. There was no threat, and nobody, the Arabs didn't attack. But then they used that, and they perpetuated that myth that the Arabs attack, or that the Arabs were preparing to attack. And thank goodness, we had a preemptive strike, and we, destroyed all their armies, and were a great victory, and so on and so forth. The truth is that they attacked ill-prepared, armies that were not prepared, that were weak, and victory there was no doubt that there was going to be victory. And it was a very, relatively speaking, very low cost. I mean, I think the Israeli forces lost 600 or 700 soldiers. The Arab armies lost 18,000 soldiers.
And the Palestinians didn't have an army, so.
Well, Palestinians weren't really part of the equation. The Palestinians were under Jordan at that point, and so at that, so I mean, and then once the campaign against the Egyptians went so smoothly and easily, the generals on their own decided to take the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. And later on, my father claimed that coup, that they should be taken to court because there was no actual Israeli government approval to take that to engage in war with Jordan and Syria, and to take those parts of but they were so successful that nobody was going to question it. My father, Ariel Sharon, even, and others talked about the fact that there was no threat. The whole notion that there was a threat was a joke, was ridiculous.
On that point about there being no formal plan to seize those territories, you also spoke about a time where your father gave a lecture in front of David Ben-Gurion, where he was talking about how the army is building up to seize land from the Jordan River to the sea. That's basically, I mean, he didn't say that exactly, but something like that. So how is it possible that there was no plan, but he gave a lecture about it?
It's not that there was no plan. There was a plan. But in that particular instance, the generals decided to do this on their own. There was no government resolution saying, yes, we are going to attack and take these lands.
Got you.
He said in that lecture, this was 1953.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. He said the military is prepared to push the eastern border of Israel to where it should be, which is the Jordan River. In other words, all from the river to the sea should be Israel. The military realizes this. We're just waiting for the government to wake up and give us that order. And there was a hint of criticism there too, that the government is sitting around wasting time while we could be, taking land that belongs to us, so to speak.
Should be according to who?
According to the Zionists, it's according to these radical Zionist patriots, of course.
Is that the first iteration of from the river to the sea? Because it happened in 1953.
Well, I think it's the first iteration that I saw that comes from an official within the system. There were claims. I mean, the predecessor of the Likud party, Menachem Begin, and that whole group. I mean, they always talked about two sides. There are two sides to the River Jordan, and they're both ours. So they talked about not just from the river to the sea. They talked beyond the river.
Beyond.
Like a greater Israel.
Their map of Israel included Jordan. And there's the Gan, and there's two sides to two banks to the River Jordan. This and this are both ours. But I have never seen any like official iteration like that where an actual commander. He was the senior, but he was not a junior commander anymore either. And a lot of those guys were actually operating with much more authority than their actual rank was, because the military was small and they all they're all big shots. Saying something like that very, very clearly, that this is the intent. And not only is it the intent, it's what we understand needs to happen. In other words, it's inevitable. It's just a question of some technicality for these old people sitting in the cabinet or around the cabinet table to finally muster up whatever it is they need to muster to give us the command to do this, because we're prepared.
And the Palestinians are completely dispensable in this entire process. It doesn't matter.
They don't exist.
They don't exist. It doesn't matter that we live there.
Palestinians do not exist. They're Arabs and they're dispensable. And there are a lot of people that said, there was a plan in 1948 to take Hebron and Bethlehem. And at the last minute, for internal reasons, Ben-Gurion said, no, we're going to stop and that's it. We're going to leave the West Bank as it is, and we're going to, And he was criticized for that for, till 1967. And then after 1967, the criticism was, and even my father said this, had we taken it in 1948, of course we could have expelled them. Now it's too late. Now you can't do these sort of things.
Yeah, now it's too
complicated. I don't know about that, because right now in East Jerusalem, they are expelling a population that has lived there for generations, right? It's a continuation of the policy.
Oh, absolutely. What he was talking about, like the mass.
No, I understand.
Like they did in 1948. What's happening in East Jerusalem it's happening throughout the West Bank. I mean, but what is happening in Jerusalem is horrifying. And the Judaization of Jerusalem is is ethnic cleansing, 101, and you can just walk down the street and see it. In other words, you don't even have to, they don't do it in hiding. They don't do it like, at night or anything. You can walk any day in Silwan and you see the destruction and you see the ethnic cleansing, right in front of your very eyes. It's horrifying what is happening in Jerusalem. And, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, when people were talking about the destruction of Al-Aqsa, I thought it was nonsense. It's never going to happen. But there always was a very dedicated movement calling for the building of a third temple. And they would take tours of, the Temple Mount, to show people. And there would be 20, 30 lunatics who would take these tours. Over the last few years, there have been 50, 60, 80, 100,000 people going on these tours. And the entire operation, the entire program, what they call the Greater Jerusalem, which includes the building of a Jewish temple instead of Al-Aqsa, is alive and well, and people are being trained. And in other words, this is a real program. And, I'm sure you remember the story of David Friedman, the American ambassador, standing there with a poster of without Al-Aqsa, with some kind of some other structure. There was supposed to be some kind of a temple. So I think that's where this is leading. When we're looking at the de-Arabization and the Judaization of Jerusalem, that is where it's going. And when we look at the people, for example, the Minister for Jerusalem Affairs in the Israeli government, he's one of those third temple people. He believes that a so-called Jewish temple should be built instead of Al-Aqsa. These people are in the cabinet, they're in the government, they are part of the mainstream now. And so I say this because I think people don't realize just how severe the situation is and how crucial it is for every human being with a conscience to stand up and say they are going to destroy Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They are going to destroy a nearly 2,000-year history, monuments, civilization, never mind the religious significance of this. And they think nothing of it.
Yeah, just take a look at what we've seen in the last few days. We've seen massive arrests by the Israeli army, preventing hundreds of Palestinians from going to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And now we're in the month of Ramadan, and this happens all the time. I mean, when I was in Palestine, I only went one time. I went 10 years ago, and I saw this happen in front of my own eyes. Palestinians being arrested outside Al-Aqsa. It's a common occurrence.
It's year after year after year.
Every year,
and it's getting worse because they're emboldened. The move of the American embassy to Jerusalem, I remember being in some conference and somebody said, well, it's not really, it's just symbolic. It really doesn't mean anything. I think people do not appreciate what that meant. That gave a stamp of approval to a process that is designed to destroy Jerusalem and turn it into this, this mythical Jewish city. They have state-sponsored programs where they teach young people how to operate the new temple that will be built there.
Already?
Yes, they've been doing it for years.
Wow.
Because, certain people, instead of being going to the military, they opt for all kinds of national service stuff.
Right.
That is one of the options, to go and be trained as what to do and how to operate the temple when, the day comes and Al-Aqsa is destroyed. And the thing is, again, 10 years ago, if somebody suggested America would move its embassy, they'd be laughed at. I mean, no, they're not going to do that because the Arab world and the Muslim world, they're not going to allow it. Well, it happened. Nothing really, nothing dramatic. There were no dramatic consequences to the moving of the embassy. And it emboldened not only...
No, in fact, they were rewarded. They got all these so-called peace agreements with countries they were never at war with Bahrain, the UAE, and Sudan, and Morocco, and perhaps now Saudi Arabia to come. So,
but it emboldened all the way down to the last soldier. And what we're seeing now, these provocations against Palestinians during Ramadan, is not a coincidence.
No.
This is not just happening because. This is part of the plan. And it's a frightening plan. I mean, you can imagine Jerusalem without the Golden Dome.
We're seeing rows of crazed settlers shouting death to Arabs in the streets of Jerusalem during Ramadan.
But it's not just these crazed, West Bank settlers. These are people that, many of them probably grew up the way I grew up.
Yeah. I would argue that they're still settlers, but yes.
This is not an extreme version of Zionism anymore.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I don't think people realize just how, by dropping the facade and having this open racist discourse in the news, on TV, on the street, at home, certainly among politicians and among people in general, opened up the possibility of just expressing, not only expressing in words, but expressing in action, the worst type of racism, the worst type of genocide against the Palestinians in a way that is even more bold than what we've seen up to now.
So you think Israeli society right now is probably the most racist it's ever been?
Not that it's more racist, but it's openly racist. In other words, it was always racist.
Yeah.
But it's openly racist. The discourse is openly racist and violent to a point that is unprecedented.
Yeah.
And that openness emboldens people. It emboldens every single soldier. And of course, we know that, killing some, kid with special needs in an alley in Jerusalem is nothing.
Yeah.
Or shooting a fatally wounded Palestinian in the head and killing him on the ground turns you into a hero. Everything from that to, Pollard landing and receiving Jonathan Pollard.
Yeah.
I mean, people are just not putting things together. They're not realizing. And that's why they can remain, these liberal Zionists think they can remain liberal Zionists. It's a monstrosity. It is racism and violence of the absolute worst kind. And the brutality knows no bounds.
And at the same time, the Zionists purport to represent Judaism, right? And I, as a Jew, take serious offense to that. They flagrantly violate every Jewish law, pretty much. And why is it, should you think, that Zionists are unable to see that Zionism is, in fact, a violation of Judaism in most cases?
Well, I actually wrote about that just a few weeks ago on I have a column with Mint News Press. If you look at what the early Zionists, Stephen Herzl, the founder of Zionism, they said immediately that you cannot be a Jew if you oppose Zionism. They made it very clear right away, because they knew that the majority of Jewish people at the time, and we're talking about Central and Eastern Europe, where there were millions of Jews. This is before World War II, opposed in the strongest terms, opposed Zionism. And they said exactly what you just said. Zionism is Judaism's main nemesis. It's worse than anti-Semitism, and they still say it today. By the way, I mean, Orthodox Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, people who are practicing Jews still say that today. That's why they oppose Zionism and they oppose the state of Israel. They reject the state of Israel, but they very clearly, and I heard this growing up as well, if you're not a Zionist, you're not really a Jew. The Jews are the Zionists are the real Jews. And again, this was something that was perpetuated from the very, very beginning. It was made very, very clear by the very early Zionists that the real Jew is the Zionist Jew. And all these other, lefty or Orthodox Jews, they're not real Jews. They're just vermin. And you should read the kind of terminology they use to describe non-Zionist Jews. The racist, anti-Semitic terms they use to describe Jews.
I read it every day in my comment section. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually read that article, Miko, that you wrote about the anti-Semitic origins of the Zionist state.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people who maybe don't know a lot about this subject, they have that association of Israel equals Judaism, Judaism equals Israel, and they would be very shocked to learn that a state that calls itself a state for Jewish people is actually anti-Semitic in its origins, but also until today, its leaders are happy to associate themselves with known anti-Semites today.
Yeah.
And they still beat up Jews in the streets for protesting the army.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, but people, again, it's you hope that at some point, especially in America, a country that gives Israel $4 billion a year, where it's a country that doesn't need $4 billion a year because it's a fully developed, rich, wealthy state, would try to take a closer look at, who is it that we're giving this money to and who is it that we're supporting and why. when Bernie Sanders says that, that aid to Israel needed to be conditioned on Israel's compliance with, human rights and so forth, that was a step in the right direction. I mean, it was a big step, but Americans need to pay attention to this. I mean, people just don't realize what it is that happens in Israel, what kind of a state this really is.
And what kind of a state it is that we are supporting as Americans, because we're the primary funder of this.
Yeah.
I also spent some time listening to your podcast, Miko. I enjoyed so many of the episodes that I listened to, especially the ones with Rabbi Shapiro. Those were insanely enlightening. He is so well-spoken and so knowledgeable. I actually listened to them a couple of times. But one of the interviews and sessions that you did that I really enjoyed was you spoke about the educational system in the United States, but also in Israel, and how the pro-Israel lobby influences and is able to actually edit school curriculums in the US public school system to promote the pro-Zionist narrative and erase Palestinian history. And then you also hosted a different session, as I just mentioned, describing the reality of the educational system and the narratives that are promoted in the Israeli educational system, which of course are the same. So Americans are in effect receiving a pro-Zionist education. And, from my own personal experience, when I was in 8th grade, social studies, Mr. Unger's class, we were learning about the Native Americans, and I raised my hand and I said, isn't what happened in Palestine the same thing that happened to the Native Americans? And I just remember my social studies teacher, his face turned bright red. And he became really uncomfortable. And he told me to see him after class, and he wouldn't answer my question. And his only question for me after class was, Miss Alborno, are you a Palestinian? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, well, that question was outside the scope of our class. So he didn't give me an answer. So, and of course I told my mom this, and she was, absolutely horrified. And she said, oh, I don't want you to be targeted. My parents came from the generation that was trying to almost hide their Palestinianness. Whereas I grew up and I said, no, I'm an American. This is outrageous. This is injustice. And I'm going to use my voice to speak out against this. But can you tell us a little bit about why it was so important for you to give space to these issues regarding education? It's actually one of the first times I've actually seen this dealt with in a panel. So thank you so much for doing that. But yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
I think people don't realize when they say the Israeli lobby or the Zionist lobby, people think of, men and women in suits in Washington, D.C. lobbying, congressmen and senators and so on.
Yeah.
Governors, maybe. They don't understand that the Zionists figured out long ago that all politics is local. And that's how they act. There's a reason why. And this is something that I learned, again, by chance. Every person who is elected to a city council, even the smallest city council in America, immediately gets invited to a trip to Israel. City council, remember, I lived in a small city council near San Diego in California. And I remember one of them sent me an email. Somebody that one of them I knew. I mean, it was a volunteer city. It was a small city of like 20,000. And they said, we got this invitation. What is this all about?
Free trip to Israel.
And they didn't take it at that particular city council. That year didn't take it. So I said, well, you really want to know?
Yeah.
And they said, yes. I said, okay, well, here goes.
How much time?
And I let them have it. And they decided that particular year not to go because they felt it was too big of a gift for a public servant. Yeah, but that's rare.
Yeah.
There's a reason why every police chief of every city in America, just think of the numbers, every city council member, every mayor, every police chief gets these invitations. They're building up. They know that as somebody who runs for city council today might run for the state legislature tomorrow, and who knows, the Senate next. So they know how to start this. They know that I don't know if every, but many of the biggest Jewish philanthropists in America are Zionists. So after a guy gives, in San Diego, the Jacobs family gave something like a $200 million endowment to the San Diego Symphony and saved the San Diego Symphony from bankruptcy. Well, how can you not work with a guy like that when he's a Zionist? And then obviously he's got influence, and obviously that comes into the conversation and into local politics. So now education, I remember looking at my kids' social studies and seeing exactly what you saw and thinking, wait a minute, they're learning about ancient Egypt, and that's like a thick part of the book.
Yeah.
and the ancient Hebrews, and that's it's the same amount of pages. How can that happen? And all of it is biblical. None of it is history. And later on in high school, AP World History, all my kids took, and I'm looking at it, and none of it is history. David, Moses, all these figures that are there's no historical proof that they ever existed. This is all biblical.
I'm sorry. Are you trying to say that the Bible is not a literal document and it's not like a real estate agreement?
I wouldn't dare suggest that. You know that. I
Wow.
wouldn't dare suggest that. But the point is that they're arguing about whether or not they should teach creationism or evolution. If you're going to teach this as history, you might as well teach creationism, because it all comes from the same source. So then,
wait, they're gonna see that you said that, and they'll be like, Miko endorsed it. You know what I mean?
Endorsed that we teach creationism, and so then actually by chance I learned from an organization in Virginia, the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, and then one in Texas, and these are the people on those panels, and they were actually working very, very hard, and they go to, because they have these social science conferences the teachers go to, and the Zionists are there with their slick curriculum and their books and their PowerPoint presentations, and they give this stuff, and they pay them to come and do these courses where the teachers get extra credit or continuing education credits.
Yeah.
And it's a huge thing, and that is the power of the Zionist lobby. It's not the people in suits in Washington D.C. Because once somebody's already in Washington D.C., they've been through all of that.
Yes.
That's the power of the Israeli lobby. That's why it's such a tough thing for us to come up against, to fight, to counter, because it's so deeply ingrained, and it's been going on for 100 years. This is not new.
One of the panelists in your podcast was a teacher, a social studies teacher, who decided to talk about the Palestinian narrative, and when she described the harassment that she endured for years and years and years, having all of her classes sat in on by school administrators and getting constantly subject to review, and every worksheet that she passed out had to be approved. And I mean, I just couldn't even imagine, when does she have time to teach? Yeah. She described a years-long process whereby the Zionists essentially were able to get into her classroom and affect her independence and ability as a teacher to teach, her own lesson plan. Yeah. So it was very. I mean, I have to admit, I was shocked by the level. To be honest, I really was shocked that they are infiltrating 8th grade, social studies classrooms. And I mean, I assumed that it was bad, but I didn't realize it was that bad, right?
No, it is thorough. They leave no stone unturned. They leave nothing to chance. They're well funded. They're well organized. They've been like this for over 100 years. Yeah. I mean, this is not a small thing. I wrote my second book, Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation. Yeah. I mean, the ADL, Zionist members of Congress and the Senate, they're infiltrating the judicial system. They're in the judicial system. That entire case was only based on a Zionist premise. None of these guys, I mean, the guys are innocent people serving, decades in prison. It's a Zionist education system. It's a Zionist foreign policy, and they are using every possible means at their disposal to make sure that the wall that protects them is solid.
We actually talked about the case of the Holy Land 5 last week in our episode. Can you tell us what you mean by the fact that whole case was based on a Zionist premise?
So the Holy Land Foundation, who did you talk to, by the way? That's interesting.
No, we brought it up just between ourselves because we were doing an episode on political prisoners, and there's a lot that's been going on with political prisoners lately. So we mentioned that there were also Palestinian-American political prisoners who were subject to a great injustice in the U.S. and are spending, for many of them, their lives now in prison for nothing.
Well, it's even worse than that. I mean, these guys ran the largest Muslim relief organization in America. They were doing a wonderful job. They were the first ones to come in after the Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, floods, earthquakes. I mean, they were around the world, not only in Palestine. They had connections and relations with other organizations. They were just adored and admired by everyone.
We used to donate all the time when I was growing up.
Yeah, you know what? I got to tell you, I hear that from everybody. Everywhere I go, people say, well, of course, Ramadan, that's where we donated, because everybody knew that they were straight.
Every year.
And they did a great job, and they were good people.
Yes.
Which they were, which is a problem for the Zionists.
Yes.
You know, they didn't know that what they were doing was a threat to Zionism. They just did what they did because they thought it was the right thing to do. But the ADL came out in the early 1990s with a booklet about the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood and stuff like that. And they mentioned Shukri Abu Bakr, who is he's one of the two that actually is serving 65 years in prison. And this whole web of lies, and this entire campaign where the FBI was listening to their phones, where the IRS was being pushed to revoke their not-for-profit status, where their partners like American Airlines and some of the banks were pressured to sever their ties with them, until 9/11 came. And the Treasury Department, I talk about that in the book, the Treasury had to show that they're seizing assets, that they're doing something. And somebody said, well, here we go. You know, round up the usual suspects. These guys are at the top of the list. So they were designated a terrorist organization, and everything went downhill from there. You know, 8-9 years later, 5 of the best people you'll ever meet are serving, you know, sentences for 15 to 65 years in federal prison on terrorism charges. You know, the entire premise is a Zionist premise. It's because, not because if they were Christians or Jews or anything else, if they were not Palestinians, these men would be free. The Holy Land Foundation would have been doing fine. They would have continued their work. But the Zionists couldn't allow that. And when you read, you know, I read over 20,000 pages of documents, court documents, and transcripts of the trials. It's impossible to believe just how powerful the Zionist influence is on the judge, on the judges, on the prosecutors, on the
evidence that was accepted.
Oh, of course, the evidence. I mean, the entire story is unbelievable, and that's exactly what I thought when I heard the story first, that it can't be true.
You mentioned how one of the main pieces of evidence that led to their conviction was an apparently undated, unsigned document that the Israeli army turned over to the courts and said proves that these guys are working with Hamas, and there was actually no proof that it even came out of the offices of the Holy Land Foundation in Palestine.
And is it true that that document was written on a bar napkin?
Well, no, the problem is that a lot of the translation was done like that. A lot of the translation was done because everything was in Arabic.
Right.
And there was one document in which they said, and I remember this, hearing about this documents while people were still wondering, okay, this is a problem, where the manager of their office in Jerusalem apparently said that, yes, they were giving some preferential treatment to people who were associated with Hamas. And it turned out that he said this under interrogation with the Israeli police, because the Israeli police came down, on them as well. And he said the exact opposite. And so the defense had the document translated and notarized, but it was too late. Nobody cared because the genie was out of a lamp. This whole story was already out there. That's it. They support Hamas. They support Hamas. They support Hamas. And that was it. Nobody cared about the evidence. Nobody cared about the quality of the evidence, the quality of the witnesses. It was all they were going to jail. Ralph Nader interviewed me, and he said, there were 2 trials. The second trial is the one where they went to jail. And he said, yeah, the second judge was a hanging judge. That's what we call a hanging judge. But yeah, so I mean, that Americans don't realize that how much their lives are being influenced by Zionism and this Zionist ideology. So it's bad enough that American foreign policy is Zionist foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting because if you ask Americans about Israel and Palestine, a lot of them will say, I don't know enough on the subject. And I don't honestly believe them. I think for some of them, that may be true, right? Some of them, they just genuinely, they couldn't point to it on a map. But for some people, they know that it's better to stay silent, right? Or to not pick a side than to get involved because of the infiltration of Zionist propaganda, the pressure that Zionists exert on Americans. I think people are aware of that.
Well, look at AOC.
Yeah.
Who's
That's a perfect
otherwise quite
example.
brilliant. When you talk to her, when she's interviewed about Palestine, she sounds like a fumbling, mumbling idiot.
It's quite a contrast from when she was running for office. She said free Palestine, right? When she was running for office, but then she gets into office.
So you feel like saying, can somebody sit with her for, give me 20 minutes, sit down with her and we'll straighten this nonsense out? Because the stuff that comes out of her mouth is like, she's like suddenly her brain just fizzled away.
I believe Ralph Nader tried to sit down with her, and then everybody accused him of sexism.
Well, I mean, it's a poor excuse. I mean, she knew she should, it's
People
a poor
have sat down with her from
the way she treats Palestine. But it's just to the point that you were making, Michael, that this is exactly the reality. People just are afraid. They don't know what to say. And in reality, they don't. I mean, a lot of people say, well, you know what? I know my brother-in-law is Jewish, or my son-in-law is Jewish, or my neighbor, or my best friend for 30 years has been, is Jewish. And I'm Jewish. First of all, so what if they're Jewish? What's that got to do with
nothing to do with it?
Super duper. Who cares?
They were white supremacists. I mean, would you still just excuse it? And that's part of the problem. I think people don't realize they put Zionism in the wrong column in their brains. Yeah. Zionism should be in the column of white supremacy and anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. That's where Zionism belongs. So opposing Zionism is opposing racism, is opposing anti-Semitism. It's the same thing. Zionism is not a response to racism. It is racism. So people just have it in the wrong side, in the wrong column in their, they need to move Zionism to the other part of their brain, to the other column. It's in the wrong column.
Yeah. So I agree that Zionism should be classified with apartheid. And I think there are a number of credible scholars who would agree with that. Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. Is it possible that they are wrong and a 14-year-old in Israel is right?
Yeah, well, that seems to be the reality we live in. That's the reality we live in. Especially, you see these lunatics on TikTok. I see your stuff on TikTok. I mean, the stuff that comes up. And the funny thing is, you can put out a serious argument about something, and all the responses are just a bunch of complete nonsense. He's an anti-Semite. Not a single argument. There was not a single argument. Palestinian, Israeli flags, a bunch of profanity. May you die of the worst kind of I mean, that's the only argument you get. And it's not only TikTok; it's any platform. That's the argument you get. There is no, and the truth is that there is no response to a serious argument against Zionism, and that is the nature of Zionists, because it is supremacy and racist, supremacist and racist. It's absurd to question the rejection of Zionism. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, and I think sometimes you have good people who say, yeah, but the Holocaust and then Zionism, thanks to I mean, the vast majority of Holocaust survivors, there's a reason they didn't go to Palestine. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not go to Israel. They stayed outside, and there's a reason for that.
And on that point, there are 50,000 plus Holocaust survivors in Israel who are in poverty. They require donations. They require mutual aid to stay alive. Furthermore,
because Israel took their money, the state took their money.
Yep. Furthermore, Hedy Epstein, Holocaust survivor and pro-Palestinian peace activist, was anally penetrated by the Border Patrol and called a terrorist. It infuriates me that I have to keep saying that, because so many people talk about the Holocaust, which part of my family died in, as an excuse for the creation of Israel.
Yeah. The answer. They say it's the answer to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is true too of the large ultra-Orthodox community in upstate New York. These are all Hungarian Jews. They're all descendants of Holocaust survivors. Mm-hmm. One just passed away, Rabbi Beck. I posted about him. He left Palestine because he wouldn't raise his children in that environment, and he was an avid, strong anti-Zionist. I remember being in Brooklyn with him. He's sitting down, this old man, and with a Palestinian keffiyeh and a Palestinian flag, And he himself survived the Holocaust. He himself, as a boy, survived. He was, came out of Hungary. So but the narrative and the PR machine and the education and everything we talked about is so powerful that it just means we on our side need to do a lot more in order to counter that, in order to get through to people. Because I think the objective needs to be that elected officials need to know if they support Zionism, they're out. They're going to lose their job. That needs to be, I think, our objective politically in the political arena. And if they don't support BDS, they're going to be out of a job. Everybody should be wearing. Everybody should be wearing this this pin everywhere.
Yeah, for our followers on Spotify and Apple, Miko's got a great BDS pin on his suit.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious, Miko, just to wrap up, because we're out of time now, but how do they treat you when you go back at the airport? Are you they obviously know you. So do you get harassed at the airport as well, or do they still, show you some respect?
I don't think anybody knows me. I mean, a few people probably know me.
Really?
I only got harassed, and I didn't get harassed. I only had problems at the airport twice.
Okay.
And that was because they saw that they learned that I visited Iran.
Okay. But they don't know about your activism?
No, nothing at all.
The BDS pin probably didn't help.
No, nothing at all. When you're an Israeli citizen, you are privileged. And that's the one thing I try to explain to people.
Crazy.
When people say, oh, yeah, you've been with Palestinians, you walked in their shoes. I'm going, it's impossible for somebody with this much privilege to ever walk in the shoes of a Palestinian. The privilege follows you everywhere. And in fact, they use it as a means. They use it sometimes in order to try to put a wedge between you and your Palestinian friends and your Palestinian brothers and sisters that you march with and you protest with, because the treatment, the privilege goes with you everywhere. But at the airport, the privilege of the Israeli passport is that's all it takes. I mean, I don't get harassed by anybody ever.
What about in the United States? Have you been subject to any surveillance or pressure from authorities?
Surveillance, I wouldn't know. I can only guess, but no, nothing at all. No.
Can I just say that when the first and only time I have been in Palestine, I went with the Interfaith Peace Builders, the group out of Washington, D.C. And I arrived in Tel Aviv on an American passport. My birthplace is Kuwait, so it doesn't say Palestine. And I was, of course,
may as well.
Right?
If it's Kuwait, it may as well say Palestine.
May as well. I was, of course, immediately separated from the group. I was one of the only Palestinians on the trip. And I was taken to a room, and the Israeli officer gave me a piece of paper, and he asked me to draw a family tree. And okay, so here I go, start drawing a family tree. At the same time, he turns the computer screen towards me, and he starts showing me pictures of Palestinians, and he starts asking me, who is this person? Who is this person? Who is this person? And of course, they're all random. I don't know any of them. I mean, they're random ID cards of Palestinians. I have no idea who they are. And after about an hour or so of this exercise of drawing a family tree and being shown photos, towards the very end, we get to a photo, and it's my grandfather. And it's a very old photo of my grandfather, but I recognized him. He left Gaza in 1955 for Kuwait and was never allowed to go back.
Was he Gazan or was he a refugee?
He was Gazan. My family is Gazan from Gaza. And we're from the minority of people who lived in Gaza but did not come from 48 territories. So, but he was never allowed to go back after 1955. And so the photo that they have of him was from before 1955. And I said, that's my grandfather. And he said, I know. And I said, okay. And then he starts asking me, when was your grandfather and your grandmother married? And I said, I don't know. I mean, who knows their grandparents' wedding date? It's not a fact that I, collected. And he told me what it was. And sure enough, that's the date they got married, because I called my grandmother after this ended and I asked her to confirm. And so there was just this bizarre conversation where he was asking me information about my family, and when I would give it, he would tell me that he already knew it. And I said, okay, well, if you already know it, then why are you wasting my time, and why are you wasting your time, But it's this fear and intimidation that they try to instill in any Palestinians from the diaspora, from exile, that go back to Palestine. They want you to know.
How long did he keep you there?
Few hours. It didn't last very long. And he knew that I had a group waiting for me. So I think that expedited the whole process.
You said a few hours, and then you said not very long?
No, but for me,
That's how conditioned Palestinians are to being inconvenienced, where 2 hours being held is like not a big deal.
yeah, no,
Yeah,
he
I
didn't
have
keep
this
me
guy,
for
I
like
agree.
14
It's been a
hours,
conversation
right?
I have with Palestinians all the time. They held you for 2 hours, 3 hours,
Yeah,
5 hours, when they shouldn't have held you even for 1 second,
right.
you know?
But I think it's interesting, the treatment of the Palestinians from the diaspora when they go back. This notion that you don't belong here, and the attempts to scare and
You know,
intimidate.
I got to tell you, as I hear these stories, and I hear these stories, believe me, Lara, all the time, and they make me crazy. And the reason they make me crazy is not only because of the racist injustice, but also because of the sense that you have to comply.
Yeah,
You don't have to comply. They're not the police. They're intelligence. They have no authority. They can't. They're not going to decide if you're in or out. They've already decided if you're going in or out. This is pure harassment and fishing for information.
yeah,
If you sat there and said, "I'm not drawing, I'm not answering, I'm going out there with my group," and that would have made no difference whatsoever as to the result of whether or not you were going to get in or not.
yeah.
And the same thing on the way out. And so I don't know if you want to put this in the
On the way out was
recording
worse.
or not.
On the way out was worse.
Yeah,
actually.
and again, I say to people, just push off, say no, push back. I'm not talking to you. I'm not giving you my whatever it is that you're asking for. Bug off. And the few people that do that realize that they do push. That if you push back, they let go because they're not police. They have no authority. They can't keep you there, and they can't not let you in. Those decisions have been made already.
Yeah, on the way leaving.
And they
leaving
use people's
was worse.
fear, and I've seen it. They use people's fear because you don't want to miss your plane. You don't want to mess around.
Well, I just wanted to enter. I didn't want to be sent back home. I didn't want to. I wanted
but
to go to
was
Palestine.
already determined, regardless of what your answers would have been and how you complied. If you did not comply, in other words, the decision to let you in or not was made already before the plane landed, because they get a list of the passengers before the plane lands.
Right.
So I always tell people, and again, I don't know if you want to include this or not.
That's absolutely.
I always tell people, do not comply with anything that happens at Tel Aviv airport. They're not police. It's none of their business about what you do with your social media. What your politics are is none of their goddamn business. If they decided to let you in, they already did. And if they didn't, all you're doing is extending and giving them hours of your time. And the same thing on the way out.
On the way out,
comply with anything they ask for.
On the way out, they of course asked to see my social media, which I thought was strange because they didn't ask to see it on the way in, but they wanted to see what I had been up to in Palestine. So they started asking me for my passwords. They of course separate me from all my stuff, and they dump all of my stuff out.
Did
and
you
they
give
started
them the
looking.
passwords?
Well, I had known that this was coming because I had spoken to other Palestinians who went through this, and I had created fake accounts that had absolutely nothing on them. And I said, okay, here you go. This is my, and I did the same thing with the photos. I had uploaded all my photos of Palestine previously, and I was in Bil'ain. I was staying with Iyad Burnat and his family. So, I was at the protests and everything, but I, of course, had uploaded all of those photos. And my last night, I just took a walk around West Jerusalem and took photos of flowers and some Orthodox Jews. And that was the only thing left on my on my camera roll. So yeah, I was prepared for all that because we share the, war stories and we get ready for the harassment that we're going to face. They also made me take off my clothes and they put my clothing through an x-ray machine and I was standing there without my clothes on.
And that's another thing.
Yeah.
You have the
and
right
they had
to
my
refuse.
stuff.
They have no right to strip search you. Refuse. If anybody's listening to this, if they ask you to take your clothes off, you absolutely must refuse. They have no need for it. And they have no right to do it.
Of course they have no need, but I had no idea. Like,
I know,
these people have AK-47s. Like, I don't know that I can say no to them.
I know. Do not ever agree to any of those things. Ever. Never, ever agree. Stand your ground. They have no right to do any of those things. It's all attempts to humiliate and harass. That's it. They have no right to do. They have no, legal right to do any of that. They do it because.
When has that ever stopped Israel?
No. I'm saying if it's not like if you didn't do it, there would be some kind of consequence.
Right.
You know what I mean? They're going to let you out. They're not going to keep you there. Otherwise, they're going to have to buy you a ticket.
Yeah.
They have to let you out. Yeah. If they're not going to let you back in, they're not going to let you back in anyway.
Right.
So everything that happens there is humiliation and harassment, and you if anybody's listening to this, I mean, do what you think is right for you at the moment. But
Well, some people are listening. We do have listeners.
my advice is absolutely do not give them any information. It's none of their goddamn business. They know everything about you that they need to know already.
Yeah.
Never agree to take your clothes off. There's no need for it. Absolutely. And there's no, there's no legal anything that can, make you do it. You do not comply. Absolutely do not comply.
Thank you for this.
It won't
advice.
change the results, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's not like if you comply, it'll make things easier. The more you comply, the
No.
worse it's going to be.
Yeah, it didn't.
The more you comply, the worse it's going to be. And this is a lesson that people don't somehow, seem to learn. That as oppressed people, the more you comply, the worse things get.
And to just draw a parallel to the United States, Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old boy that was shot recently and murdered, he was running from the police, and the second he complied, they shot him point blank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many examples. I mean, Jews were ordered to take off their clothes and march into, in the death camps and march into, where they were killed. They did it. Why? The more you comply, the worse it gets. So at the airport, absolutely fight those sons of bitches. Do not comply. Stand up to them. And if there's more than one of you, and if there's a group, the group should be there making a big fuss.
They were.
And
I think that's why it lasted only 2 hours.
You know what I mean? That's how it needs to be seen.
Yeah.
It's just harassment for the sake of harassment. It will not impact the end result.
This is very good to know.
This is my advice. And if people are coming in from the bridge, come as late as possible. Come in like half an hour before they close the bridge, because they want to go home, and it's going to be a lot easier for you.
Yeah,
smart.
I'm talking about the Sheikh Hussein. I'm not talking about King Hussein in the south. I'm talking about Sheikh Hussein, where you come in as a tourist on an American passport. The one in the north. These guys are sons of bitches, and their only pleasure is to see Palestinians humiliated and harassed. The more you push back, the better it's going to be for you and for everybody else. And if you're in a group, the group better stand up there and make as much noise as possible. Don't be afraid of these people.
I have one last question, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
We're up against such a gargantuan force. How is it that you maintain hope?
Well, that's easy. My Palestinian friends are fighting. Their kids are resisting. Bassem Tamimi is one of my best friends in the world. His daughter, Ahed, we all know what she did.
Yeah.
And she's now studying law. I mean, Palestinian kids are going to school in Gaza. Every other person has a PhD.
Yep.
Kids are going to school when they know their schools are just a wall because everything else has been destroyed by Israeli bombs. Moms make their lunches and comb their hair and make sure their clothes are pressed and their uniforms are clean as they go. They don't even know if they're going to see them at the end of the day. How can I not have hope? How can I not have hope? Look at Palestinians in Palestine every single day. Look at what they do. Look at how hard they resist, how steadfast they are. How could you not be inspired by that? That's where I draw my inspiration and my hope.
Wow.
Okay, last question. Last question. If you'll let us. Just one last one. What does decolonization look like in Palestine?
Well, the process that I imagine when I imagine this. So I remember when de Klerk stood up in South Africa, and he declared that Mandela and all the political prisoners were going to be freed, that all the political parties were going to be unbanned, and that one person, one vote elections were called. That's step one. So basically now you're going to have a legislature and an executive that represents the entire population, everybody who lives in Palestine, in historic Palestine, from the river to the sea. That's step one. I see it could be Netanyahu. I mean, he's probably going to be prime minister for a very long time. It may well end up being him, the guy that ends this, brings down, was there when Zionism comes down. Mm-hmm. Now, de Klerk didn't do it because he woke up feeling like a saint one morning. It was BDS. And when I was in South Africa, everybody said BDS brought down apartheid. Have no doubt about this, okay? Which is why they support it so strongly. That's the first step. Now you have a legislature. Now you have issues you need to discuss. Now we have to discuss the right of return and reparations. Not the right of return as an idea, as some kind of a theoretical notion. The actual mechanisms to allow the refugees to return and be paid what they're owed. And there's, $3 billion, $4 billion coming from America every year. There's plenty of money to do that. And they're actual numbers, because as you know, as they say, the Khaduha Mafrusha, they took Palestine fully furnished. And people don't realize just how true that is. I mean, money in the banks, produce in the fields, on the tree. I mean, they took untold amounts of money and things that have monetary value. So all that has to be done. All this has to be paid. Now, Palestine has a rich Arab history, a rich Muslim and Arab history. And a lot of these places, names have to be brought to life. Monuments that are still standing but are falling apart. Dahir al-Omar's mosque in Tabariya, for example, is standing like it's some kind of a just old building. I mean, these are glorious, glorious monuments, a glorious history that needs to be brought back. Now, the organization Zukhrot, which you may have heard of, Zukhrot, possibly.
I saw your interview with the guy.
A wonderful organization.
Yeah.
I just did an interview also with the executive director as well. That's going to be coming out soon. They have a project called Envision Return, where they actually have young people going in and designing what are the villages going to look like again.
Amazing.
What are the return villages going to look like when people come back? How are they going to rebuild them? There has to be that, this is not decolonization, but these are the steps to decolonize. And of course, the name Palestine, which goes back, I see you have the book right behind you.
You see it?
4,000 years. Yeah, 4,000 year history. The name Palestine goes back almost 4,000 years. That is the name of the country, and if anybody doesn't like it and anybody doesn't want to live among Arabs and anybody doesn't want to live in a free society, they can go somewhere else. But I think these are the steps, I think, that will lead us to a real free, decolonized, real liberated Palestine, democratic Palestine.
That was brilliant. Thank you so, so, so much, Miko. It was really a pleasure to speak with you and to meet you today.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming on, Miko.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of the Palestine Pod. Find us at www.palestinepod.com. You can email us at palestinepod@gmail.com. We so appreciate you taking time to listen to our podcast. Go ahead and like, subscribe, leave us a comment or a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the Palestine Pod. Have a great day.
It's the Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Sit back and relax and learn something. Palestine Pod. Expand your mind. Palestine Pod.
Made fun of you for wearing colors last time, so you came dressed for a funeral.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's hard because it's like, you can't be too casual. You're on camera.
Yeah, I agree. You can't be too casual.
But then you're also like, well, I don't want to wear I don't want to be fancy. I'm also just sitting in front of my laptop. So it's a delicate balance. Should I do the part where I introduce him?
Yeah.
Let me just do it and get it over.
Also, if you cough into the mic, you should have a mute button.
I don't have a mute button, dude.
Oh, that's right. All right. Well, then cough away from the mic.
Okay, so I don't blow your ears.
You're fucking you speak away from the mic, but you cough right into it. I swear, I cannot with you.
Oh, that's so good. That's actually true. I literally did cough at it.
Yeah. That's how you get corona digitally.